Carl had worked at the company for over 10 years. His job was simple but essential: cleaning the offices, mopping the floors, making sure everything was spotless. He worked long hours quietly, never complaining. Most people didn't notice him. To them, he was just another janitor, another face in the background. But Carl didn't mind. He found pride in doing his work well, in knowing that he was helping keep the place running smoothly, even if no one acknowledged it. Mr. James, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. As the boss of the company, he commanded respect from everyone. His tall, imposing figure and sharp suits made him a man who could not be ignored. He was the kind of person who believed that power came from control, and he made sure to remind his employees of that every day. Cold, distant, and often arrogant, Mr. James ruled the company with an iron fist, making decisions that affected hundreds of people without a second thought. He had little patience for mistakes, no matter how small. That morning, Carl made one. As he cleaned the hallway, his mop accidentally brushed against a nearby office door, causing a slight scuff on the polished floor. It was a minor mistake, something that could easily be fixed. But Mr. James was in a bad mood, his stress from back-to-back meetings weighing on him. He watched Carl from his office, his brow furrowing as he saw the scuff on the floor. "You," Mr. James called, his voice sharp, echoing down the hallway. Carl turned, his heart sinking. He had no idea what he had done wrong. "Get in here," Mr. James ordered, motioning toward his office. With a sense of dread settling in his chest, Carl walked toward the door. As he entered the office, Mr. James didn't even look up at him. He was seated behind his desk, his fingers tapping impatiently on the wood. "Do you realize what you've done?" Mr. James asked, his tone icy. Carl swallowed hard. I'm sorry, sir. I'll fix it right away." But Mr. James was not interested in apologies. He stood up, his gaze cold as ice. "I don't have time for mistakes, Carl. I'm sorry, but I have no choice. You're fired." The words hit Carl like a punch to the gut. Fired, just like that. Years of hard work, of quietly doing his job, meant nothing. He stood there, his mind racing, but no words came out. He wanted to protest, to explain, would do no good. Mr. James had made his decision. I understand," Carl said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He turned and left the office, not wanting to make a scene, but his heart felt heavy with confusion and hurt. As he walked out of the building for the last time, Carl couldn't help but wonder. How could something so small, so insignificant, have cost him everything? Carl grew up in a small, run-down neighborhood, a place where hope was often in short supply. His childhood home was a modest apartment, shared with his mother, younger sister, and 2 brothers. Money was always tight. His mother worked long hours at a local diner, barely making enough to keep food on the table and the lights on. Carl's father had disappeared when he was just a baby, leaving his mother to shoulder the burden of raising 3 kids on her own. Despite the challenges, his mother had always tried to keep their spirits up. She would remind Carl and his siblings every day that hard work and determination would get them through anything. That one day they'd rise above their circumstances. Carl, even as a young boy, believed in those words. He was different from the others in his neighborhood. While his friends often got caught up in trouble or let their dreams slip away, Carl kept his head down and worked hard. He took odd jobs from a young age, delivering newspapers, shoveling snow, washing cars, anything that could bring in a few extra dollars. School wasn't easy, but he worked relentlessly, knowing that education was his ticket to a better life. He didn't mind the long hours or the lack of sleep. He had one goal: to make something of himself. After high school, Carl didn't have the luxury of going to college. His family needed him, and he couldn't afford the tuition even if he had gotten a scholarship. So, he found work wherever he could, loading trucks, cleaning offices, doing menial tasks. Eventually, a job as a janitor opened up at one of the largest companies in the city, a massive glass and steel tower that loomed over the skyline. Carl saw it as a stepping stone, an opportunity to get his foot in the door. He was hired immediately, his first real break in years. But despite working inside the towering building every day, Carl remained just a janitor to most of the employees. To them, he was invisible. They walked by him in the halls without a second glance, too wrapped up in their own lives to even acknowledge his existence. The only time Carl's work seemed to matter was when he was scrubbing the floors or taking out the trash. He never complained. He was used to being overlooked, to being seen as nothing more than the person who cleaned up after them. Still, Carl didn't let it bother him. He was patient. He knew that the path he was on wouldn't be easy, but he believed in the quiet dignity of his work. Every task, no matter how small, was a step toward his larger goal. He was saving money, learning about the company, making connections in the background. People didn't see it, but Carl was always paying attention, always watching, always planning. At home, life was still hard. His mother had grown older, and her health was beginning to deteriorate. His younger sister had 2 kids now, and Carl did what he could to help support her. He lived paycheck to paycheck, sending what he could to help his family while still trying to save for something more. But the struggle never dulled his spirit. Carl had dreams, even if no one else knew them. He wanted more than just to survive. He wanted to prove that a man could rise above his beginnings, that he could achieve greatness, even if the world seemed set against him. But Carl knew that proving himself would take time, patience, and above all, respect. He treated everyone with kindness, his coworkers, the executives, even the people who barely noticed him. He believed that no one was too small, too insignificant, to deserve respect. He carried that belief with him every day, even as the world around him overlooked his true potential. The morning had started like any other. Employees rushed into the building, greeting each other with tired smiles, preparing for the usual day of meetings and reports. But there was a buzz in the air today, an unspoken sense of anticipation. Word had spread that there would be a major announcement at the company, something big. The boardroom was full of the high-powered executives, all of them dressed in their sharpest suits, their expressions tense as they waited for the news. Mr. James, standing at the head of the table, felt the pressure building. He was used to being in control, used to being the one who made the decisions. Today, however, he was on edge. The company had been struggling in recent months, and the board had decided it was time for a change at the top. A new CEO would be appointed, someone with a fresh vision, someone who could lead the company into the future. Mr. James was certain that the new CEO would be someone prominent, someone with a vast portfolio and years of experience in the business world. He imagined a businessman who would command respect with every word, someone who could take charge and make tough decisions. He was ready to step aside, to hand over the reins with grace and poise, as he always did. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting, the door to the boardroom opened. Mr. James straightened up, expecting to see an influential figure walk through the door. But what he didn't expect was Carl. Carl, the janitor. The same man Mr. James had fired just days ago for a minor mistake. Carl stepped into the room, his posture straight, his expression calm and confident. He was wearing a suit, a perfectly tailored one that fit him like it had been made just for him. His hair was neatly combed, his eyes focused, and there was a quiet authority in the way he moved. Mr. James froze. The room fell silent. The executives looked at each other in confusion, unsure of what was happening. Carl walked toward the head of the table without hesitation, his footsteps steady, his presence commanding the room. As Carl reached the front, he turned to face the stunned crowd. With a calm, measured voice, he spoke. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Carl. I'm the new CEO." The words hit like a thunderclap. A collective gasp filled the air as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Carl, the janitor, the quiet man who had always cleaned up after everyone, was now standing before them as the new leader of the company. Mr. James, still frozen, could hardly believe what he was hearing. The power dynamic in the room had shifted in an instant, and no one knew how to react. Carl smiled politely, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice as he addressed the boardroom. Mr. James could hardly process the words that had just left Carl's mouth. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Carl, the janitor, was the new CEO? It didn't make sense. He had been fired just days ago, barely even given a second thought by anyone at the company. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't even someone anyone would consider for such a high position. But here he was, standing tall in front of the board, confidently claiming the leadership role. The boardroom was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Everyone in the room, including Mr. James, was stunned. The reality of the situation was hard to grasp. How could Carl, who had spent years quietly cleaning the floors, now be the one to take control of the entire company? How is this possible? Mr. James finally managed to stammer, his voice faltering. You were just the janitor. You've been working here for years. Why would you? How could you? Carl raised a hand to silence him. His calm, steady presence filled the room, as if he were the one in charge all along. I understand that this might be difficult for you to comprehend, Mr. James, Carl began, his voice cool and composed. But everything has been in place for a long time. I've been watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment. The tension in the room thickened. Mr. James felt a cold sweat forming on his brow as Carl's words started to sink in. Carl paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air before continuing. The truth is, I've been the majority shareholder of this company for years, long before I started as the janitor. I've always had a stake in this company, but I knew the only way to truly understand it, to understand its culture, its weaknesses, was to be on the inside. So I took on the role of janitor. Not as a position of servitude, but as an opportunity to observe, to learn. Mr. James blinked, his mind struggling to catch up with Carl's words. You were the owner? But why? Why hide in plain sight like that? Carl met his gaze without flinching, because it was the only way to see the truth. People don't pay attention to janitors, Mr. James. They overlook us, treat us like we don't matter. But I saw everything, every decision made behind closed doors, every flaw in the company's management, the disconnect between the leadership and the employees, and I knew that I could do something about it. He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle. The room was still, the board members unsure of how to respond. Mr. James could hardly believe what he was hearing. This man, who had been nothing more than an invisible figure in the company, had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. Carl continued, his tone now more assertive. And as for you, Mr. James, I hired you years ago not because of your leadership skills, but because I knew you would give me the perfect opportunity to understand this company. I observed you, watched how you interacted with the team, and saw the cracks in the foundation you were building. Your lack of genuine leadership, your obsession with power, and your disregard for the employees. It was all part of the plan. Mr. James felt a flush of embarrassment rise to his face. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one to dictate the direction of the company. But now he realized with a sinking feeling, he had been nothing more than a pawn in Carl's game. Carl's voice remained calm and steady as he continued. I'm not here to exact revenge, Mr. James. I'm here to fix what's broken. To make this company a place where people are valued, where employees are treated with respect, and where decisions are made with integrity. You were part of the old system, and now that system ends. The tension in the room was palpable. Carl's revelation had turned everything upside down. Mr. James, who had always been the one in charge, was now just a spectator, stripped of his power. Carl, the janitor, had quietly built an empire, and now he was the one holding the reins. Now, Carl said, his voice carrying authority, let's get to work. With that, Carl's calm, measured tone filled the room as he began to lay out his vision for the future. The executives, still reeling from the shock, listened closely, realizing that this was no ordinary CEO. Carl wasn't just the janitor who had cleaned their floors. He was the man who had seen it all, understood it all, and was now ready to take control and lead them into a new era. Mr. James stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, struggling to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. The reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. He was no longer in control. His empire, which he had built with a cold and ruthless hand, was slipping from his grasp, and the man he had fired so carelessly was now the one pulling the strings. Carl's calm, steady gaze locked onto Mr. James, who could only look back with a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. There was no anger in Carl's expression, no malice, just quiet authority. Mr. James, Carl said, his voice unwavering, your time as CEO has come to an end. The words hung in the air, final and inescapable. For the first time in a long while, Mr. James felt small. The power he had once wielded with ease was now gone. The room was silent as Carl's statement echoed through the boardroom. But this time, the silence wasn't one of fear or respect for Mr. James. It was one of uncertainty, of change. The employees who had gathered for the meeting, those who had been mistreated by Mr. James for years, began to shift in their seats. The tension that had once filled the air when Mr. James entered a room was replaced with something different. It was subtle at first, but it was there. Hope. Hope that things would change, that they would no longer be dismissed or disregarded. Carl wasn't the man they had thought he was. He wasn't a cold, calculating boss who ruled with fear. Carl was a man who had seen the company from the ground up, who understood the inner workings of the business, and who cared about more than just profit margins. As Carl laid out his vision for the company, the room began to feel lighter. His decisions were thoughtful, measured. He spoke not of cutting costs and streamlining operations at the expense of people, but of creating an environment where every employee, from the janitor to the CEO, felt valued. There was a sense of fairness in his words, a deep understanding of what the company could be if it truly operated as a team, rather than a hierarchy of power and exploitation. "I believe in people," Carl continued, addressing the room. "And I believe that every person in this company has something to offer, no matter their position. We rise together, and we succeed together." Outside the boardroom, the employees who had once shuffled past Carl without a second glance now started to notice the difference. There was a newfound sense of excitement, of curiosity. What would Carl do next? How would he lead? Meanwhile, Mr. James stood silently as security came to escort him out of the building. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped. The man who had once been at the top of the corporate ladder was now just another figure being quietly removed from the equation. Carl, the man he had underestimated, the man he had fired, was now the one in charge. As Mr. James walked out of the building, Carl watched him leave, his expression unreadable. The shift in power had been complete. With Carl at the helm, there was no going back, and as the door closed behind Mr. James, the room seemed to breathe a little easier, the atmosphere filled with the promise of a new beginning. Under Carl's leadership, the transformation of the company was nothing short of remarkable. Where once the building had felt cold and oppressive, it now hummed with energy and purpose. The shift wasn't just in the structure or the operations, it was in the very atmosphere. The cutthroat, competitive environment that Mr. James had cultivated, where employees were pitted against each other in a race for dominance, gave way to one rooted in collaboration and inclusivity. Carl's first change was simple but profound. He introduced open forums where employees at every level could voice their ideas and concerns. It didn't matter whether someone was a top executive or a janitor. Everyone had a seat at the table. For the first time, employees felt like their contributions mattered. It wasn't just about making money anymore. It was about building a company culture where people were respected and valued for their skills, their ideas, and their dedication. Opportunities for growth and development flourished under Carl's leadership. Training programs were introduced, mentorship initiatives took root, and people were encouraged to pursue their passions within the company. The once rigid and hierarchical structure was replaced by a more fluid, team-oriented environment where everyone was encouraged to learn, grow, and move up. Carl's leadership style was in stark contrast to Mr. James's. While Mr. James had ruled with fear and power, Carl led with empathy and understanding. He didn't speak in grandiose terms or make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he demonstrated his commitment to the company's success through his actions. By taking the time to understand the needs of the employees, by showing them respect, and by acknowledging the hard work they put in every day. As the months passed, the company flourished. Profits rose steadily, but more importantly, the employees were happier. There was a newfound sense of purpose among them. They were motivated not by the fear of losing their jobs, but by the pride they felt in the work they did. And Carl, once the overlooked janitor, was now the admired CEO, respected not just for his position, but for his integrity, his vision, and his ability to lead by example. For Carl, the emotional impact was immense. His journey from janitor to CEO was a testament to resilience, determination, and the quiet strength that had always defined him. He had never sought recognition or accolades. But as he stood in the corner of his office, looking out over the bustling building, he realized that the respect he had quietly earned over the years had finally brought him to the place he always dreamed of. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was the leader, the one who had quietly rebuilt everything from the ground up. And as he watched the company thrive, Carl knew that his journey had been about more than just reaching the top. It had been about proving to himself and to everyone else that true strength lies in quiet dignity and unwavering belief in one's own worth. In the end, Carl's journey serves as a powerful reminder of how the world often overlooks those in humble positions. Too often we judge people based on their titles or appearances, unaware of the potential they hold. Carl's perseverance, patience, and integrity led to an extraordinary transformation, proving that true strength doesn't always come from power or prestige. The lesson is clear. Never judge someone by their position because you never know the depth of their abilities. Sometimes the quietest people carry the greatest potential to change the world. If you enjoyed this story and were inspired by Carl's incredible journey, make sure to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below with your thoughts. We'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. And if you know someone who would enjoy this, be sure to share it with them. Every bit of support helps us bring you more amazing stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.